Okay, so ADHD did not give me STDs. I've never had STDs, but ADHD's caused me to have a ton of problems, if you can call it ADHD. So when you're under a certain age and you're put under a massive amount of stress and you have pain and suffering, what are you gonna do if you don't have fight or flight? You're going to distract yourself. So you're going to do something to stimulate euphoria, endorphins, dopamine, whatever, right? And when you have dopamine being fed through a drug like Adderall or something like that, you're suppressing, you may not think this, but you're suppressing pain and suffering a lot. And when you suppress pain and suffering, the brain is not trying to distract itself at that time. But I mean, eventually Adderall stops working. Eventually, all ADHD medications, I'm sure there may be some outlier that does help long term, but still probably doesn't actually work. Because ADHD is not in a lack of dopamine, it is in the fact that when you stimulate dopamine across the neuron, the brain is getting this consistent thing where it's not needing to spike reward to suppress pain and suffering, right? The brain just has dopamine. It just has dopamine being fed through the neuron. So the suffering and the pain that you went through, you developed this distraction mechanism, and now you're seeking out pleasure, whatever. Even if you're treated and you're under drugs or whatever for ADHD and stuff like that, if you do not solve the problem of suffering and pain and dealing with that suffering and pain and confronting suffering and pain and stuff up front, you're going to continue to jump all over the place. You can take Adderall or whatever for 20 freaking years and still, I mean, you can get nowhere. There's plenty of people that take Adderall and get nowhere. They end up just taking Adderall and being completely distracted. And after a while, drugs like amphetamines and ADHD medications, they do not work. They literally stop working. For the majority of people, it may take a couple years, may take 20 years. Maybe somebody can manage it long term where they're taking it a couple days a week and they'd be all right. But all of this stuff ties together. When you have the body and the brain under stress, notice that if you have ADHD, you try to distract yourself. Notice that when you've had a panic attack in your life, you were trying to get on the phone and say, hey, oh my gosh, I'm gonna die, right? You're sitting there trying to distract yourself, constantly trying to distract the brain. And I think that everyone has panic attacks or whatever, everyone has a little bit of this, but the people that have developed actual ADHD, don't get me wrong, I think that there's an underlying genetic maybe component to some of this, but mostly it's not. Mostly it's not genetic. Mostly it's because you didn't have a parent or someone there to guide you through stress and pain when you were a child. Someone left you there when you were in severe pain and stress and pain, and you were put under pressure and you absorbed the stress and pain of whatever was going on, and you were trying to distract yourself. You were distracting the brain from feeling that physical pain because it was unbearable. And now when you go into things that you have to focus on, you're distracting yourself. You're literally sitting there distracting yourself. And Adderall, all these things are feeding dopamine across the neuron into the receptor. And eventually that receptor gets kind of burned out, and then you come off of whatever you're on, and these other times you're completely distracted because you got nothing suppressing pain and suffering anymore. And you can sit there and say that it's a dopamine issue or whatever. Your dopamine is probably about the same as anyone else's. It's literally the same. If you didn't have regular dopamine, you would be sitting there with your hands shaking with Parkinson's symptoms. And it wouldn't be necessarily that Adderall or something else would help that. You are distracting yourself because you have developed the neurological pathways to do so. You are suppressing pain and suffering with pleasure centers, reward centers in the brain that are opiate their opiate receptors, their endorphin opiate receptors, and their dopaminergic, and they're all this other stuff, GABA, all that other junk, right? Whatever these magical neuroscience words, right? I mean, those are pretty basic, but yeah, when it comes down to it, you're distracting yourself over and over again. Pay attention to where you jump. Like, pay attention to where you jump in the other direction. When you are sitting there and you say to yourself, this is unbearable, I can't really do this, and then you go jump to whatever your addiction is or whatever you've used in the past to distract yourself that stimulates dopamine, or you take your Adderall, or you take your amphetamines, you take your ADHD medications, and then all of a sudden you can focus because you have dopamine going through, and then now you've suppressed some pain, some suffering, and everything else because you have this constant feed of dopamine, and now you're focusing. You're focusing. You have an endorphin. You have a constant feed, and ADHD medications are just good about the steadiness, right? If you take something like heroin, fentanyl, or alcohol and stuff like that, the spike in dopamine and the endorphin pathway is way too high, way too fast, and will knock that ADHD down, but it's not going to provide that steady state of focus. But none of these things are going to provide a steady state of focus as much as dead set just going through the suffering and pain. Teaching the brain to not distract whenever it is in severe suffering and severe pain is where you're going to be at. That's where it's really going to go and lead you to extreme focus and just being able to focus and get things done. Because notice, you have something you have to do that day, and then you jump to doing something else, right? You nitpick at these little procrastinating or whatever. Your avoidance of that, what you're perceiving as suffering and pain, is causing you to do this. So another thing is, you're not used to whatever you're doing, right? Like, if you're not used to doing mathematics and you go into doing mathematics and then you're distracting yourself, if you just sit there and you get used to doing mathematics over time, if you get used to doing schoolwork under that feeling, you'll eventually surpass that. You can sit there and you can train focus. You can train focus no matter what you do. You can train the brain to not distract. And to sit there and tell people that ADHD symptoms are completely permanent and all this other stuff is ridiculous. And all this, it's just ridiculous, like completely ridiculous. I don't have it fully figured out. I fall back into mine every once in a while, but for the most part, I'm pretty dead set. And I've been through a ton of things that most people wouldn't have made it through. And I can say that after going through significant amounts of more suffering than a person can actually go through, that ADHD symptoms are definitely an avoidance of pain and suffering and just completely jumping all over the place to avoid pain and suffering up front, or what they perceive as pain and suffering. Some people with ADHD may say, "Oh, ADHD, I don't have an abstinence. I can go through pain and suffering and stuff like that." Can you really? Can you really? Like, what you're perceiving as pain, you may perceive something else as more painful or less painful than something else, right? You may have a food addiction. You may say that you've never had an addiction, but yet you have a food addiction. You may say you have whatever. Personally, I believe almost every person has had some kind of addiction because the human brain can just become addicted to things, right? And everybody has the mechanism to become addicted. But this main thing with ADHD here, when it is distraction, you're distracting yourself. The brain is jumping to seek pleasure and euphoria over addressing the direct stress. I'm sorry if this video is all over the freaking place, but I'm just got to get this out there.